Towards the end of 2017, several voices within the community of those who suffer from feminist degenerative disorder, a serious mental disorder that is still sadly untreated, started warning about a potential backlash resulted from the brutal insanity that #MeToo is. Later on, in early December, the sentiment was picked up in the portion of the far left that is still occasionally, although mostly by accident, engaged in something that normal people would call thinking. Politico and the British Brainwash Corporation published their own versions about the backlash that's coming in their attempt to get ahead of the story and attempt to appear moderate. This will not work. You're too late at the party, and we'll be here to make sure it gets a lot worse. Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, I've been trying to put together a video on this for almost a month, but something else kept on coming up. I mean, thank God for the Christmas season. It provided enough of a time window so I can catch up with the news and also put some more thoughts on the virtual paper for future videos. So, last time I mentioned #MeToo was on December the 8th in the 168th episode of The Voice of Europe when we covered the story from the BBC by Katie Kay titled "Why Women Fear a Backlash Over #MeToo." Then I said that every single supporter of the Me Too campaign is unequivocally an enemy of capital C civilization. Sure, I conceded at the time that some of them may just be ignorant, even indeed convinced of their own allegedly good intentions. But that's still irrelevant. Supporting civilizational destruction out of ignorance or perceived good intentions is still bad. After all, most dictators, and indeed most governments in general, as my co-host pointed out last month, were convinced of their fundamentally good intentions, even while committing horrific crimes and destroying civilizations. Since then, however, I've given more thought to the matter, and I think we should not just embrace the backlash, but become active parties in enforcing it. You see, there are some of us who've been smelling this for quite some time. As I have alluded in previous videos, I am a practitioner of the no women policy when it comes to work environments. And if I have no choice, then always be recording and doors always open. Preferably in a place that also is under video surveillance to which I can have immediate access. Paranoid? Maybe. Though, as I always argue when it comes to personal protection and privacy, it is not paranoia when they're really after you. And this whole thing has been coming for quite some time, especially in the former Western Bloc, and I adopted the policy since sexual harassment protections became an official recommendation by the European Commission. So that's long before it was a binding law almost anywhere in Europe, really. Moreover, I have been advising others as well, especially those who are due to conduct any sort of business in the former Western Bloc, to follow my policies. Needless to say, 100% of those who heeded to my advice are doing fine, whereas the same cannot be said about those who disregarded my advice. Sure, some of those are also doing fine, I would say about 70% of them, but the rest are either struggling or have long gone bankrupt. Now, I'm not going to say this is definitive proof that there is a 30% risk chance. I suspect it's slightly lower than that, but I will say that the risk is simply much higher than the mainstream would have you believe. And at the end of this video, I will recommend some measures to take for your own and your business protection. But until the list of policies, let's dwell a bit further on how the backlash is being brewed and what to expect on the, let's say, macro-cultural level. Right now, the hashtag #MeTooWitchHunt, because that's exactly what it is the biggest ally in the goal of building an effective, long-lasting, and brutal backlash. This is summarized very well in an article by leftist publication Politico, which wrote on December the 10th the following, quote, "In the past few weeks, a number of accused men have disappeared Soviet-style from public life, with the work of some, such as Louis C.K. and Garrison Keillor, for example, withdrawn from distribution. There has been discussion about whether everyone accused deserves a professional death penalty or whether there should be a scale of punishment. After all, the violations run from the gamut from multiple allegations of rape to unwanted touching." But in a statement on Facebook calling for Franken's resignation, New York Democratic Senator Kirsten Gillibrand came out against making such distinctions. She wrote, "We should not have to be explaining the gradations between sexual assault, harassment, and unwelcome groping," close quote. In a New York Times op-ed, actress Amber Tamblyn wrote that making distinctions will mean the cultural change that is happening will stall and bad behavior will win out. So she wrote, "The punishment for harassment is you disappear. The punishment for rape is you disappear. The punishment for masturbation in front of us is you disappear. The punishment for coercion is you disappear." This erasing of distinctions between the criminal and the loutish was a central feature of the campus initiative of the Obama administration and led to many unjustified punishments. Definitions of sexual wrongdoing on college campuses are now seriously overbroad, the feminist Harvard law professors wrote. They are so broad as to put students engaged in behavior that is overwhelmingly common in the context of romantic relationships to be accused of sexual misconduct. What is considered a reportable offense on campus should give pause to those concerned about free speech and about the possibility of campus rules taking over the workplace. Do we really want to create workplace policies where any perceived wrong of a sexual nature leads to possibly career-ending sanctions? Close quote. And the answer is yes. Now, of course, nobody from the far left side would dare to admit that in public, but that doesn't make it any less true. The purpose of the feminist far left is sexist and misandrist in nature and must be treated as such without any regard for their feelings. As evidence for my assertion, I will refer you back to the left-wing Politico article, which in a very rare moment of honesty from that purulent rag, comes out and says as much. Quote, "The movement to stop sexual harassment in the workplace will eventually move past this moment of shocking allegations against famous men and should soon focus on the many non-famous people in quotidian circumstances. But top news organizations are not likely to provide as much due diligence about those cases. No doubt many disputes will more resemble those on campus, in that the charges will be about ambiguous situations for which there is little evidence. This amazing moment has a chance to be truly transformative, but it could also go off track if all accusations are taken on faith. If due process is seen as an impediment rather than a requirement and an underpinning of justice, and if men and women grow wary of each other in the workplace, as Laura Kipnis, a feminist professor at Northwestern, writes in her book, Unwanted Advances, quote, "I can think of no better way to subjugate women than to convince us that the assault is around every corner," close quote, and that is exactly what will happen. The hysteria will, at least at first, hit the common man. And the common man doesn't have 10 journalists at the CNN and Washington Compost on his speed dial to get them to run defenses for him. This has been going on for years, mind you, much more often in corporate America than everywhere else, but slowly, over time, it has become quite customary in most big corporations as the lunacy of HR has trickled down from company to company. Nevertheless, whatever it's been going on in the last 10 years, it will get a million times worse in the next 12 months. Okay, maybe not 1 million times worse, but it will get significantly worse during 2018. The good news is that it won't last long. The bad news is that there will be collaterals, and it won't be pretty. Now, hints on how this will look like have been duly provided by the BBC, except they think that's a bad thing, whereas I think it's great. So the BBC says, quote, The biggest backlash risk is a fake accusation that will undermine genuine accusers. Whether for personal vindictive reasons or for political strategic reasons, a woman will falsely accuse a high-profile man of sexual misconduct. The story will get attention, and then when it's proven to be fake, the backlash will begin. The response will quickly be, you see, all these stories aren't true. Women are making it up, close quote. Now you see, I believe the overwhelming majority of the stories are not just false, but knowingly and maliciously concocted. And while some of you may think this is an extreme view, even roughly a third of the Swedish public agrees with me, and they've been through decades of state-enforced feminist brainwashing, as I have shown multiple times on this channel. And even with all of that brainwashing into listen and believe and similar horse manure, 45% of Swedish men believe that most of the #MeToo stories are entirely nonsense, and a similar belief is shared by 30% of Swedish women. 45% of Swedish men and 30% of Swedish women, that means about 40% of the Swedish public. And that is a country where militant misandry is state policy. The fact of the matter is that all of this is driven by a tiny group of misandrist activists and silently supported by roughly half of the female population. Everyone else, though, that would be most men and roughly half of women, instinctively knows this is all bullcrap. And this is something of which the BBC is also aware of, which is why they also write, quote, "The next fear is that men will get so nervous that they're going to be accused of harassment that they will simply stop hiring, meeting, or socializing with female colleagues. There are reports this is already happening. We will get shut out from the room where important decisions are made because men fear our presence? How ironic would that be? Already men are nervously asking what's acceptable and what's not. Is all flirting now banned? Is a pat on the back okay, but a pat on the bottom always a sackable offense? This confusion could fast turn to anger. The risk is that men, feeling under siege, kick back and say enough is enough, this is not fair. Then we risk losing the support and sympathy of our male colleagues. We do indeed become seen as witch hunters, or worse, as witches. A backlash now against women would be the worst thing that can happen. It would shove this topic back under the carpet for years, and that's exactly what must happen and will happen. Similar warnings were provided by American leftist academics, those that merely have insane ideas but are not brutally insane themselves, who, quoted by Politico, said the following, in a scathing rebuke of today's investigation and adjudication processes on campus, the National Center for Higher Education Risk Management, a leading Title IX consulting firm, released a white paper in April accusing many Title IX officers of victim favoring and putting students' sexual decisions under a microscope. The paper warned that unless campus processes were reformed, a backlash could set back the entire consent movement, and that also needs to happen. All of this nonsense, the entire consent movement, the sexual harassment bullcrap, all of it needs to be torpedoed mercilessly and without any regard for their alleged good intentions. And they will, much faster than many dare to imagine at this moment. Now, I don't expect you to believe me, because no matter my track record of being right on most of these things, what I am saying does indeed sound impossible to those who've never been involved in political agitprop and thus have no idea just how weak these structures are. And I don't mean just morally weak, I mean that goes without saying, but weak in terms of support, strength, and numbers. Remember when I told you that James Damore was just the beginning? Well, a few days ago, another bombshell hit. Meet Marlene Jekyll, a friend of James Damore, operating as a conservative in the tech industry, who, upon finding herself on the wrong end of the leftist thought police, decided to change her mind on things about retaliation and openly fighting the left, and thus filed a lawsuit against Google and all of its satellite feminist groups, and also went public with the whole story. Now, if you're into reading, I'll leave a link in the low bar to her essay, and if you want in audio format, the YouTuber 1791L published a video with her reading the essay, so there is no reason not to familiarize yourself with this story. Now, make no mistake, Marlene Jekyll is a conservative to the extent that one can be a conservative in those circles, but she's waking up real fast on the things we've been talking about on these boards for years. Within the left, you don't play fair at all for any reason, because playing fair with an enemy that outright refuses to even consider the very idea of playing fair is a sure way to lose. Marlene's story looks very similar to the beginnings of #Gamergate, and there is a strong suspicion that it will end similarly with Gamergate, though it will take slightly longer this time because the issue is much more complex than it was in the case of Gamergate. Well, that and the fact that momentum takes a lot more work to build. Now, mind you, this is not the only example. There are a plethora of medium-sized enterprises who are taking steps to curb all of this insanity. Most of the changes will be very silent, but consistent and quite brutal. The glass ceiling that the feminists have been whining about and that never existed will soon become a reality, and I cannot stress just how needed this is. Because people cannot know just how bad things can be if everything around them is great. And people rarely acknowledge how great things are unless they have personally experienced far worse. And this is particularly true about women in the workplace. Because again, for decades, women have remained silent over the increasing misandrist pressures being applied on the workplace. They either didn't care or sometimes actively supported all of this. Are there any exceptions? Of course, but the exceptions are there to confirm the rule, and as a rule, women failed consistently to object to the insane misandrist policies and even sought in droves jobs in the HR departments to enforce those said insane policies. Well, after decades of sowing all of this, women will finally get to reap what they've been sowing, and it will be glorious. Feminists, of course, will whine and cry foul and nobody will care. Because the card has been used up. You killed the golden goose. The reservoir of empathy is now completely empty. Enough is really enough. The first signs are already visible. Look up in your local area for new employees. They're overwhelmingly male, 9 cases out of 10. They will become more of the norm in the coming years, for sure. Promotions will be shut out for most women most of the time. Video and audio surveillance will become the absolute norm in the companies where for various reasons they can't afford to just fire all the women. Relationships in the workplace will disappear much faster than you dare to imagine right now. Around 30 to 40 years ago, a revolution happened. For the first time in history, a significant chunk, and in some countries even a majority, of new marriages or establishments of relationships occurred between people who met each other at the workplace. All of that is about to change, and the change will be much faster than the gradual change that occurred in the 70s or 80s. It won't be overnight, mind you, but it will take less than a decade. It will be very accelerated. Again, feel free to think I'm exaggerating, but I'm looking straight into the beast. The reason I was able for so many years to predict these things is because I have eyes and ears where nobody suspects. And while nobody will come out and say, from now on we're not going to employ women anymore, the chattering is already ongoing. And while feminists, some white knights and some women will argue that this is retaliatory, nobody will care. In fact, nobody cares right now because it's not about retaliation, it's just about personal protection. Contrary to what feminists would have you believe, there aren't really that many people out there who hate women. I mean, heck, my grandma was convinced that male misogynists not only don't exist, but cannot exist, since that would mean a man who hates women at least as much, if not more, than women hate each other. In her over 90 years on this earth, she hasn't been able to meet or read about such man existing. And I suspect she was right. With that said, there are a lot of men out there who think just like me, whether they articulate it or not. Namely, why do I have to deal with this bollocks? Why should I endanger myself, my career, my business, and my livelihood so some broads get to feel better about themselves? How about no? And that, my fellow deplorables, is coming. Alright, so let me give you now 7 tips on how to both protect yourself and also be part of the change in the cultural narrative, which will then lead to changing politics. Number 1, avoid hiring women. This one's pretty obvious and straightforward. As it turns out, most of the time, in most of the places, hiring women is not needed, like at all. Multiple experiments in the real world have shown beyond reasonable doubt that all-male environments do much better than both all-female and mixed environments. Even today, almost every breakthrough that occurs in the market comes from an all-male company. There are exceptions, of course, but as a general rule, you don't have to have women in your company. There is no such thing as equally qualified, and even if there were, err on the side of the man. It's just better that way. Is it harsh? Of course it's harsh, so what? Hiring a man comes with an almost zero risk of him living for several years to have children but still expect you to pay him the full salary, as it is the case almost everywhere in Europe with women right now. Hiring a man also means no #MeToo bullshit, no sexual harassment lawsuits, and if the company is all male, also no more sexist discrimination, ludicrous nonsense. Number 2, if you have to employ women, err on the side of the older ones. Statistically, older women are not just more experienced due to their age, but also a lot less likely to believe stupid nonsense. As I've shown in the video Ideas Have Reproductive Consequences, older women have much more sound and non-retarded ideas about what constitutes and especially what doesn't constitute sexual harassment. With the exception of requesting a sexual favor, which even I believe is sexual harassment, the overwhelming majority of old women agree with me that things like wolf whistling, commenting on attractiveness, asking to go for a drink, making sexual jokes, putting a hand on the back, or even looking at breasts, the overwhelming majority of old women agree that these things don't constitute harassment, nor are they inappropriate at all, especially in a work environment where the same people have been working there for quite some time now and spend a significant chunk of their adult life right there. So if for some reason you cannot choose not to employ women, then the next best thing is to employ women aged 45 or older. The older, the better. Number 3, if you're an employee, don't talk to women in the workplace, preferably at all. And if you have to, make sure you record it. But these days, most of this can be avoided entirely. Just send an email instead. And make sure you have all of the emails saved on something you have control over. And I mean this as seriously as possible. I know this helped me a lot. I think I told this story before. When I was working at a big telecom corporation, I had a female boss who was a very nice lady. However, some of her female underlings were utter cancer, so I avoided those entirely, especially the 2 of those who would never stop with the ass kissing. The nice lady who was my boss thought I was a bit over paranoid for avoiding those like plague, but she didn't give much thought to it, until she and 2 male colleagues found themselves accused of sexual harassment. Needless to say, my policy is still the absolute norm in that company, even years after I left the place for non-related reasons. And the male upper bosses? Yeah, they're all into, let's avoid having any women around our meetings. And at that company, this has been going on for almost a decade. Welcome to the new normal. Number 4, always be recording, also known as ABR. Ideally, there should not be even 10 seconds of an interaction with any female that is not recorded, preferably in video format, though sometimes audio would suffice. Especially in bigger firms, you can't really avoid contact with females entirely, so it's better to always be recording. Harsh? Yes, but better safe than sorry. Besides, you should always be recording anyway, because who knows what else you might encounter. I mean, after all, false sexual harassment is not the only concern. Look at the Lindsay Shepherd case. Because she recorded, we all now know a bit more about the social justice inquisitions that do exist in universities. In fact, students, male students in particular, should always be recording, preferably in video. It's not hard nowadays. A hidden camera with 720p or even much higher video quality costs less than $50. It's the most useful investment you could make in the current year, especially as a male student, but in general if you work in a mixed environment. Number 5. Actively do discriminate based on degrees and activities. This one's simple and perfectly legal, and in fact encouraged by legislation. If you see gender studies on a resume, throw it out in the garbage disposal without a second look. If you see women in tech or women in anything really as part of the applicant's secondary activities, throw the resume in the garbage disposal without a second look. If you see any sort of activity or university course that could even remotely hint on a progressive candidate, throw it straight into the garbage disposal and move on. This is something I've been consistently and openly applying every time I had control over an employment decision or whenever my opinion was required. Not only does this lead to much better candidates being employed, but also diminish the risk of progressive and egalitarian nonsense being introduced into the organization. And again, this is perfectly legal. Good luck to the lefties to argue in court that it's unfair that they can't get a job because of their gender studies degree, i.e. a choice that they themselves made. And although I understand why many don't want to be open about these things, I still do suggest to everyone to be particularly open about this. Make sure everyone around you knows that no gender studies graduate will ever see an interview with you, let alone employment. Same with promotions. If you can decide a promotion and you have amongst the options individuals with gender whatever in their resumes, make sure to cross those names off the list of potential promotions right off the bat. This is not just a perfectly valid, very legal and sound risk mitigation tactic, but also an impeccable tool towards sending the message back into society that being interested in genderist nonsense is unacceptable among civilized people. Number 6. Do reject business with companies that don't yet understand this. Now, this one's harder to come by in some industries, but it is nonetheless possible. The purpose of this is not to make statements, but to pressure other organizations to also reform along anti-feminist lines. And again, once you understand just how weak feminist structures are already in various situations, you'll find out how easy it is to knock them down. You'll find out, though again, this isn't true in all industries. Some are really deep into the manure. For instance, recently I caught wind that 4 medium-sized enterprises are planning to switch off their subscriptions to a telecom carrier that has recently employed some feminist nonsense. So, being the compassionate agitator that I am, I persuaded the owners of these enterprises to include in the list of reasons for termination of service the fact that the carrier is too feminist for civilized men to engage with it. Now, when one individual or even 100 individuals do this, a big telecom carrier can ignore it. However, when 4 other corporations with 700 users do this over just 1 month, that can no longer be ignored. Additionally, I advised other 9 small companies to call in and ask for a renegotiation of the contract and specifically ask a feminist discount. Basically, if you want us to stay with you, you will give us this discount, so we'll pretend we didn't see that you brought that feminist lunacy in there. And lo and behold, 2 months later, most of the feminists were fired. Their department got quietly shut down, and most of the upper management is now convinced that having it in the first place was a mistake. Now, all I did was just make a few phone calls. The rest was the internal hype, because feminist activists always get scared at even the tiniest amount of backlash. So by the time this issue reached up the upper management, they didn't hear that 700 users from just 4 companies quit and a few other small businesses threatened to quit and asked for a discount. That's not what the higher-ups heard. The higher-ups heard the risk assessment and the management team, which projected much higher losses than actually occurred and projected a much higher backlash than it was actually happening. Basically, these organizations worked just like newspapers in the past, when one letter to the editor was believed to represent 100 readers. The point I'm trying to make here is that you should use your power to pressure organizations to reform along anti-feminist lines. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but not even trying is definitely the wrong path. I'll explain more about this in a future video about practical agitation and subversion. Until then, let's go further. Number 7, and the last one, do practice the Mike Pence rules. All the time, everywhere. Don't go on a trip with a woman alone who is not your wife or your long-term girlfriend. If you've been with her for less than 2 years, then don't go. And I mean this both in the workplace-related framework and outside of it. Similarly, don't meet alone with a woman not your wife or your girlfriend, at all, for any reason. If you have to, then always be recording, always be in public, preferably in a place that has video surveillance, as I said, and ideally have another witness. More eyewitnesses, the better. Harsh? Yes, but until there will be sustained female opposition to misandrist nonsense like #MeToo and misandric policies that do abound, better be safe than sorry. Is there any advice for women in the bag? Well, yeah. Start building the female opposition, ladies. And I actually mean it. Until I see 80% or more female opposition to things like #MeToo, I see no reason to advise any man to do anything else but practice the Mike Pence rules and in general follow the policies that I have outlined here. Stand up for your male colleagues when they're being railroaded by HR or other disdainful forces. Become relevant, basically. You see, unlike feminists, I'm not a revolutionary. That's why I set a goal here, and a realistic one, I might add. I mean, roughly half of women already reject the #MeToo nonsense. Well, except Sweden, but that's a mental disorder, not a country. So it is not unrealistic at all to raise that figure from 50% to 80% or more and make it more militant. In fact, I think it's a very modest goal and quite easily achievable if women really wanted to. And if they don't, well, then in that case enjoy 100 years or more of Mike Pence rules. As explained in the video Ideas Have Reproductive Consequences, the system of incentives is rapidly changing, so women will adapt whether they like it or not, just like men have adapted whether they liked it or not. So the only question is whether women want the adaptation process to be a slow, painful, and full of collateral damage, or a process that is faster, mostly not painful, and with a minuscule amount of collateral damage. And that is a question to which I don't have the answer. Because unlike feminists who profess to tell me what appropriate or healthy masculinity is, I don't profess to tell women what to do. That's their business. What I do profess is to tell young men, especially young white men, that there are all other ways than total submission to the leftist cuckery. I'm not under any illusion that this will go easy. No, it won't, because people rarely learn the easy way. Learning the hard way seems to be the only method that works. But I still do hope that some people will be willing to learn the easy way. See, sometimes even I adopt the doctor mentality. Alright, that's really all I had to say on this issue. I probably won't come back to the #MeToo topic anytime soon because there really isn't much more to add as far as I'm concerned. So with that, I'll cede the floor to you. What do you all think? Am I being too harsh? And if you believe so, do provide an alternative, as in, what policies could men adopt to shield themselves from the witch hunt that are also non-harsh or less harsh in your view? Because that's all I care, protecting men at all costs. Women have a multi-billion industry to protect their interests, so you'll excuse me if I don't give even 10 seconds of thought on how these policies might harm women. That ship has sailed a long time ago. You've had decades to come up with policies that are not insane. I'm out of hoots to give. The reservoir of sympathy has simply dried up. And that's too bad. So, with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. Please do consider throwing a shekel if you derive any value from the work being done here. Do subscribe to my social media, and I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.